So today I'm bringing you a review / discussion of The Virgin Suicides by Eugenides. This was a reread for me. I read this when I was 17 and really didn't get along with it. Firstly, what it's about, Virgin Suicides, quite self-explanatory really. It follows 5 sisters, the Lisbon sisters, who all commit suicide in different ways. And it follows them from the view of the boys on the street. So it's a first-person look at them, but from somebody else's opinion and somebody who didn't know them. The boys have just collected sort of memorabilia and bits and bobs from the girls' lives and interviewed people who were involved in their lives, and sort of built up a picture of them from that. It starts with the first sister, the youngest sister, Cecilia's suicide. It follows the sisters sort of after they have dealt with that shock and gone into mourning for that loss, and it follows them up until their own suicides. That's not a spoiler. I mean, the first line, which is a very good first line, on the morning the last Lisbon daughter took her turn at suicide. It was Mary this time, and sleeping pills, like Therese. The 2 paramedics arrived at the house knowing exactly where the knife drawer was, and the gas oven, and the beam in the basement from which it was possible to tie a rope. So, you know straight away that they've all killed themselves. I really didn't get along with this before, for reasons that I think I missed a lot of the sort of subtle implications in there. I read it when I was quite young, and I read it just after I'd read Prozac Nation by Elizabeth Wurtzel, and I was very much into that kind of personal or almost memoir-esque fiction about mental illness and people's personal journeys with mental illness. This is not that. This is more a outside view of suicide and a study of suicide and people's reactions to suicide. And it's very interesting, actually. Before I read this, I remembered that a few years ago, Lena and Sana did a very interesting discussion about it, which I will link down below. I watched that before I read this, and I would definitely recommend doing so, because you sort of then go into it looking at it from a completely different angle. I think the thing that bothered me slightly this time, and it bothered me a lot last time, was the fact that we are seeing these girls from these boys' point of views, and the boys don't know them, so the characterisation of the girls isn't really developed. But actually, I can see reading it this time that that's almost an intentional thing. You know, Eugenides could have just written it from the girls' point of views and made it into a typical mental health or suicide memoir-esque thing, but he didn't. He very purposefully, I think, made the narrators people who were outside of the girls' initial circle. And it's interesting because we never know the girls, we just know the projections that other people put onto them. Certainly the boys put a lot of projections onto them, and they almost make them these angel-esque type figures, and I don't know whether that's partly because they were obsessed with them before and they all loved them, or whether that's just because they're looking back on it and the girls have obviously killed themselves, so they've become sort of concreted in the boys' heads in that age and almost like magical figures that can't be reached. I don't know. But it's a very interesting look at them, and it's a very interesting look at suicide. It really discusses the idea that suicide is completely misunderstood. There's a very interesting bit after the girls have all killed themselves where it talks about the sort of articles that are going around at the time and the news things, and obviously people are trying to pinpoint why they would have done this, and it's all about, you know, chemical imbalances and living conditions and their parents and things like this. And actually I think what people miss is the fact that they were just sad. It almost, for me, felt as though the girls, there were still things that bothered me, and I think the girls almost made a show of their own suicide, and I don't understand still why they did that. For example, they invited all the boys, I don't want to spoil anything, but they invited all the boys to be involved in a way, and it's sort of just, I don't really know what Eugenides was trying to get at with that, because he's almost saying that, you know, suicide is misunderstood and people assume that it's got to be this massive problem, or you've got to be clinically depressed and stuff, and if you're not, then why would you even consider suicide? They don't accept the fact that being a teenage girl is hard, and these girls have had it harder than most. And yet then he does this thing that almost makes out that their suicide is for attention, which didn't really fit in with the whole thing that he was trying to do. I felt like that was a bit jarring. Also, something that bothered me was that when the boys, after Cecilia's death, the boys get hold of her diary, and they say that there's nothing in there about feeling depressed or suicide. She just writes mundane things like, oh, today I went to the shop, sort of thing. And again, it makes it seem as though she's doing that for other people's sakes. Like, it's her personal diary. She would have written in there about how she was feeling. I mean, she tried to kill herself twice. Second time she was successful, the first time she wasn't. So it was not like it was a spur of the moment feeling sad kind of thing. It was something that she calculated and worked out, and she would have written about it in her diary unless she was thinking that other people were going to get her diary. And that kind of bothered me, because I don't think that was realistic necessarily. It's very interesting, obviously, because Cecilia dies first. You're almost left wondering whether the other girls have killed themselves because of Cecilia's death, or because of the way they are treated after Cecilia's death. They're almost ostracised, treated as strange and delicate, and they're almost tarnished with her brush. There's a bit where they actually go out to the school dance, and one of these sisters says that, you know, Cecilia was the crazy one, we're not crazy, because people do sort of keep their distance from them. You know, psychologists at the school are always on them, trying to make sure they're okay, and I feel as though they sort of resent that fact, you know, their sister killed themselves, not them. So their own suicides then almost came as, this is what you wanted kind of thing, which is also a very interesting discussion point there. It would be a fascinating book, I think, to study. For me, this is a book of two halves, basically. We have the first half, obviously, when Cecilia dies, and when the girls are sort of living their lives at school and being sort of treated like they're going to break any minute. And then they go to the dance, and I feel like there's a split there. I liked it a lot more beforehand. After that, their mother, who is quite crazy anyway, she locks them in the house, doesn't let them go anywhere. Lux, one of the sisters, is seen having to burn all her rock records and things, and the house just falls into disrepair. They never leave the house. They live off of sort of cans and things that they kept. That bothered me, because everybody on the street knew what was going on. I think it's written sort of quite far in the past, but you would still have, something still would have been done. She was keeping these girls hostage, basically, in the house. They weren't going to school. They weren't leaving the house. They weren't allowed to leave the house. They resorted to actually flashing their light on and off after, like, God knows how long of being locked in this house. And I just thought, especially seeing as the boys were so obsessed with them, and I mean, the boys started ringing up the house knowing that the girls would pick up the extension line. The boys wouldn't say anything and wait until the father and mother have hung up, and then they would sort of play records to the girls, and they had a conversation in that way. And a lot of the girls' messages were basically, help us, we need your help. And it's quite a worrying fact that nobody on the street thought, actually, that's quite a serious situation, we should probably do something about that. I don't know whether that was Eugenides sort of trying to say that it was the mother's fault almost, or adding in that dimension that it could have been the parenting, but I feel like it was quite an extreme extreme way to do so. I think you could have done that in a lot more of a subtle way. So I found that all a bit strange. I don't really know what that was all about or why that had to happen. It wasn't, again, very believable for me. But ultimately, I don't think this book is about being believable or realistic. It's about the extreme opinions that people can form about something that they don't actually know anything about. And I think that's really fascinating. I think it's an important book. I would recommend reading it when you're older, and I would recommend rereading it. Certainly watching that video before you read it. It's interesting, and it's an important book, and I would recommend it, even though before I really didn't get along with it. And it looks as though, I had a flick through the reviews on Goodreads last night. Some people give it 4 or 5 stars, some people give it 1. There doesn't seem to be an in-between with this book. I think you either get it or you don't. I think if you go into this thinking it's about the girls, you're going to be disappointed, because it's not about the girls. It's about suicide as a wider subject, and about people's reactions to suicide and the way that they're quite unhealthy. And I think it's definitely worth a read, but it's not necessarily an enjoyable book at the same time. So it's a very strange one. I think it tore my opinion, certainly, and it obviously tears other people's. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear anybody else's thoughts if you leave them down below. Let me know if you've read it. Bye!